the 14th. Let's pray together as we start tonight. Father in heaven, we just want to say thank you for giving us this day and giving us this opportunity to be together tonight as a group of people concerned about our community and concerned about people that we care about, and desiring to just educate ourselves to know better the way that addiction affects the brain and rewires what takes place within the mind of a person. And so we pray tonight that you would give us open minds, that you would give us insight, and that you would give Alex guidance as he speaks tonight. Help him to speak clearly, and Lord, help there to be communication between he and us, where we would grow in our understanding of what's taking place. Most of all, we want to say thank you for Christ, our Savior, who came to rescue us from sin. And we pray these things tonight in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
And before I introduce Alex, I do need to say that back on our table we have a couple of sheets back there. We have a flyer. One is for our Thanksgiving dinner. We're having a community Thanksgiving dinner here. The church is allowing us to use that. It's going to be Thanksgiving evening at 6. What time will it be? 5 to 8. We are taking donations for turkeys and for other things. You can sign up back there to fix something, or we might have someone to fix the turkey. If you all want to donate a turkey, we'll have somebody fix it and prepare it for us. We also have T-shirts. We're pre-selling T-shirts. So the sign-ups back there. We need the money beforehand. We can't ship it, but see the tape before you get out, and all that stuff will be there. So now, Alex Elswick. I met Alex. I was in court one day, and I think Alex called and said, "Hey, I'm a PhD student at UK. Can I talk to you?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And so Alex just came in and he said, "Okay, well, I've got this program that I want to help. I want to start with drug court." Alex works for the UK Extension Service at UK campus, and he said it's called Beyond. We want to provide services to people in recovery in the community through the extension offices in all the counties. And I said, "Sure, let's do it." So Alex is one of the great things that he's done is he started the Beyond program, which does provide living skills and financial skills and nutrition and that kind of education through the extension offices in Kentucky. So that's one of the many things Alex has done. Alex is a PhD candidate at University of Kentucky. He works for the extension agency there, and he is one of the founders, along with his mother, of Voices of Hope in Lexington, which is an amazing organization. We use tons of the resources for recovery coaches. They have all kinds of meetings there. They have all kinds of events that are sober events. What else do you do, Alex?
That sounds good.
Alex speaks a lot of places. I got to see him. I got to spend a little bit of time with him in Atlanta. I went down to the Prescription Drug and Heroin Summit last spring. Alex was brought up on stage with the National Institute, director of the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And Donald Trump introduced him on stage and brought him on stage during his speech. And so Alex has been all over CNN and all those other channels too. So we are lucky to get him here. He's one of the most engaging, entertaining, informative speakers I think I've ever seen, especially on this topic. So without inflating his ego even more than it is, here's Alex Elswick.
Dangerous. That's quite an introduction. A lot of times when you go to speak somewhere, people ask you to send a bio ahead of time, and it's the most arrogant and obnoxious thing in the world. And I like to send these 5-page bios. I want you to read the whole thing before I get up there. So my day job is a specialist for substance use prevention and recovery. So the way I see my job is there are a lot of folks at UK who do brilliant research, and it's really important research. But the reality is, when was the last time that any of you were sitting down on the toilet and you picked up a copy of the Journal of the American Medical Association, right? Probably not recently. There's some really valuable information in those academic journals, but none of us just read those for fun. So there's always a problem. How do we get that important research into the community? And that's essentially what my job is. So we call it research translation. Take that research, bring it into the community, to you all, to community groups, so that you can use it to affect change, so you can do what you do even better. And I think what Reach Out is trying to do in Bourbon County is something that sort of mirrors in a lot of ways what we do at Voices of Hope as a community organization, and something that I think this information can help make sense of. The only other thing I want to say before I jump in is, as you'll learn in a second, I went through a lot of treatment centers. I had a lot of trouble in my addiction, and nobody ever stopped to explain to me what was happening with my addiction. Right? I went to 12-step meetings and I learned about the disease model a little bit. I heard a lot of people throw around a lot of opinions, a lot of different ideas about what addiction could be, but nobody ever stopped to say, here's what the evidence says, here's what the science says, here's what's actually happening to you. And an interesting thing happened when I learned what's happening in my brain and in my body. It was hopeful for me, because I came to understand that if that's what's happening in a disease state, I understand how I can get better, right? I understand that there's a solution, that it's real. And so I hope that by showing you a little bit of that, it'll help arm you with the information to help people in this community. That's part of the idea. So normally I like to be a little more nuanced with the main messages, but I figure we'd be really straightforward. There are two key takeaways. If you hear nothing else from what I share over the next 45 minutes, I hope you hear these two things pretty clearly. And the first is that substance use disorders or addiction, they're chronic disorders. So we found ourselves, many of you I'm sure, raise your hand if you've ever been in a Facebook debate with somebody over whether or not addiction is a disease. Has anybody ever done that? Of course we have. If you're like me, you've been there, right? I've sworn all that off. I'm 2 years sober from Facebook fights, that's true. But we've all been there, right? So we spend so much time fighting as addiction to disease, how do we characterize it, that we're missing a critical word, which not only is addiction to disorder, but it's a chronic disorder. We're going to unpack what that means, and I hope that's really clear to you by the end. The second key takeaway is if substance use disorders are indeed chronic disorders, then they require ongoing management. And the only way that people get well and stay well is if they have access to care and access to resources that they need on an ongoing basis, right? And any of you in this room who are in recovery, who have been to jail or have been to treatment or have had any period of abstinence or recovery, you know that there's no magic bullet for this thing, right? It takes work and it takes time. So I figured I'd start off by sharing just a little bit of my personal experience. I like to do this to kind of give some context and give a narrative. I don't want to give you a whole testimony because I know you all hear a lot of that. I believe there's so much value in testimony, something so powerful about somebody sharing their story, somebody who's been there, but there are folks who do it far better than I do. So I'm just going to share just a little bit. I was born and raised in Lexington, Kentucky. Really happy, healthy home. I was never neglected. I was never abused. My parents didn't divorce. They don't use drugs. It's probably safe to say that my dad hasn't had a drink yet in 2019, not because he's trying to be sober, but because he has no appetite for it, right? He's never smoked a cigarette in his life, you all, right? And he had a son get addicted to dope. Try to figure that one out, right? Makes no sense. Even though I grew up in this kind of nice little suburban home, there were two things about who I am as a person that I couldn't change. And the first is that I was born with a genetic predisposition for addiction. We can talk a lot more about what that looks like, but informally, you could just say my mom had 7 uncles and 4 of them had drug and alcohol problems. And that meant that from the day that I was born, I was more likely than the average person to have a problem with substances. And secondly, from the time that I was very young, I've struggled with anxiety. And I've been diagnosed with so many anxiety disorders. In fact, my first job was as a therapist, and the first time when I was doing my practicum, I got a copy of the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic Bible that therapists use to diagnose mental disorders. And I flipped to the section on anxiety disorders, and I was shocked that my picture wasn't in that section, right? Because I'm telling you, all of them, got them all. Most interesting of which, I'll share this with you just because it's funny. I probably shouldn't stigmatize mental illness this way, but when I was in the 7th grade, I was so anxious when I would take exams that I would sit and pluck at my eyebrows compulsively until they were completely gone. It's an anxiety disorder called trichotillomania. And we went to family Thanksgiving, and I was probably 13, and my cousin Eric was probably 7 or 8, and I remember him sitting across the Thanksgiving dinner table from me and doing like a triple take, and he said, "Yo, what happened to Alex's eyebrows? They're all gone. He looks like a jack-o'-lantern." It's like, not a nice thing to say about someone with a mental health condition, but part of the reason I share that with you is because despite having an ideal upbringing, I guess you could say, coming from a suburban home or whatever, something wasn't right? You can throw out all the clinical speak, you can say really plainly something wasn't right. It didn't feel good to be me. It's that strange thing about the human experience that I don't know what it's like to be in your body, and you don't know what it's like to be in mine, right? It was hard to be in my body and get through a day. And I think that explained my attraction to drugs and alcohol. So I always share the first time I smoked weed because I think it's so important. I don't remember the first time I drank alcohol. I know I was 12 or 13. I know I loved it because I did it many times after that. But I remember the first time I smoked weed like it was yesterday. And I remember where I was, and I remember who I was with, and I remember the song that was playing out of my buddy's truck. It was a Ludacris song called Blueberry Yum Yum. Some of you all may know that song. And it's funny because I teach at UK, and one of the classes I teach is all freshmen. And when I share that with the freshmen about Blueberry Yum Yum, it's like crickets. And you know why? Because Ludacris isn't cool anymore. You know what I mean? Like, I've aged out. Now I'm old, and I get to feel what that feels like. It's not cool. But the reason I remember that is because it was such an important experience for me, for better or for worse, because everything I'd seen in pop culture, and TV, and movies is people smoke weed and they get slap happy and silly and they act stupid. And that wasn't my experience at all. I smoked marijuana, and it was the first time in 15 years on this planet that I just felt normal, right? I just felt okay. And it's so common when you talk to people who experience addiction to describe their first experience with drugs as like a feeling of just normal. Like everything was just okay. Like I was profoundly okay. So I developed this chemical relationship with drugs and alcohol. For the sake of time, you know, when I was 18, I got arrested on a bunch of drug trafficking charges. Then I had oral surgery to have my wisdom teeth removed. I got prescribed oxycodone. I got addicted to it. I spent 3 years addicted to oxy. 3 years later, I had a $150 a day habit. I did some deplorable things in order to support a $150 a day habit. When I used to share my story, I used to give people the laundry list of all the awful things I did, because I kind of thought that's what I was supposed to do, right? Like I'm supposed to stand in front of a room full of people and bare my soul and repent of my sins, and over time I've learned that there's no value in that. You don't profit, I don't profit. Probably only further stigmatizes addiction, so I don't do that anymore. But I did some awful things, and I ended up spending time homeless in 4 different cities. I went in and out of 5 treatment centers, I went to jail, and I ended up spending the last days of my active addiction sleeping under a bridge in Dayton. The Highway 35 overpass that runs through downtown Dayton, and holding a cardboard sign that said homeless and hungry, and taking people's money and shooting dope. And I walked out from under that bridge into a Salvation Army, which is essentially like a homeless shelter. It had a treatment component, but only by name, only nominally, because, you know, in my field now we talk about evidence-based practices. The Salvation Army isn't well known for using evidence-based practices, right? It basically just gave me a bed to sleep in, and I'm grateful for that. And you know, I spent probably 2 of the most miserable months of my entire life, those first 2 months, just agonizing, miserable months at the Salvation Army. I was suicidal for much of it. And I mean, I had dealt with suicidal ideation at other times in my life, but this is the first time that maybe I scared myself a little bit. Like really, I didn't want to wake up and do it anymore. And slowly things started to change, and I ended up spending 6 months at the Salvation Army. And I want to, instead of telling you the rest of the story, I want to pause there. I want to talk about some of this, and then I want to return to that story in a little bit, okay? So in order to get to where we want to get to, we got to talk about the brain. So show of hands, how many of you all have seen this before? You've seen that. All right, so I've been telling people, this is news to a lot of folks, but I'm going to drop a bomb. That's not actually your brain on drugs. That's an egg in a frying pan. And we have no idea what it has to do with your brain on drugs. It's a part of one of the most ineffective prevention campaigns of all time, right? So we are going to talk about your brain on drugs. So, fair warning, this is going to feel like it's just scientific or like it's just educational. I promise you, if you stick with me for the next 5 minutes, you're going to have a different understanding. It's going to make sense, and it's going to matter. This is not just academic, it's going to matter. So stick with me. Everybody stick your hand out in front of you like this. Tuck your thumb into your palm and wrap your 4 fingers around your thumb. There you got your brain, all right? So you can put your hands down. If you talk to an evolutionary scientist, they'll tell you that throughout human evolution, our brains have evolved outward. In other words, the outermost part of our brains, those 4 fingers represent your cortices, the parts of our brain that are most developed, that separate us from other species. Like right here, your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that houses executive functioning. So it's your ability to make decisions and weigh consequences and forecast into the future. Those things that your dog can't do, right? How can your dog lay at your feet? 14 hours a day because it doesn't have that ability, right? That's what humans have, puts us at the top of the food chain, separates us from other species, that's great. But as you peel back the cortices and you go more to the middle of the brain, you're going back in evolution, right? So you're going into structures of the brain that we share with other species. You get to a part of the brain called the limbic system. And it's also called your survival circuitry, because it's the part of your brain that matters the most in terms of your survival. And here's how it works. Anytime you do anything that makes it more likely that you're going to wake up to survive to see another day, any of those behaviors we would say that confer evolutionary benefit. So when you drink water, when you eat food, when you have sex, when you bond with another human being, all of those behaviors are rewarded in this part of your brain through the release of this neurotransmitter called dopamine, right? Probably you've heard about dopamine in pop science. It's your feel-good neurotransmitter. So what your brain is doing is conditioning you for survival. Think about, has anybody in here ever tried to potty train a dog before? Try to break a dog? Like, what do you do when you take the dog outside? It goes to the bathroom. What do? You give it a treat, you hit the little clicker, give it a treat, right? You praise it, right? You're conditioning the dog to go to the bathroom outside. So in a lot of ways, your brain is potty training you for survival, right? Oh, good boy, you ate food. That's good. Here's your reward, right? So you're more likely to do it again. It works really well when you're like out in the wild, you're a hunter-gatherer, and you're trying to survive. But it's a huge problem in terms of addiction, because when you use a substance, you get an absolutely unnatural amount of dopamine. And when I say an unnatural amount of dopamine, I use that word deliberately because we're talking about an amount of dopamine that no natural behavior that you do out in the world is ever going to be able to replicate. So no amount of Krispy Kreme donuts, no amount of sex, no amount of friendships, of social interaction or bonding is ever going to bring you the same amount of dopamine you get from a drug, right? You're just absolutely inundated with dopamine. So as an example, Alex uses an opioid. He gets this DA, represents dopamine. I get a huge flood of dopamine. I feel really, really good, right? But not only do I feel good, but to that part of my brain that's responsible for my survival, that part of my brain is convinced that this must be really integral to my survival, right? My cortex, my cortices, they know that this is artificial. Hey, this is coming from a pill. This isn't real. This doesn't matter to our survival. But my limbic system doesn't know that, right? My limbic system just thinks this must be really important for me to survive to see another day, because it's clearly more important than water and food and sex, right? So I'm inclined to repeat the behavior. But so far, all I've basically told you is that drugs feel good. And so oftentimes people would say, Judge Privet, why would you bring Alex here for a presentation to tell us that drugs feel good? We all know that. Well, here's where addiction really sets in, is that your brain and your body is always trying to maintain balance, right? That's what we call homeostasis. So imagine that day after day, I'm using a pill, and I'm using a pill multiple times a day, and my brain is getting flooded with dopamine. My brain's getting overwhelmed. Well, after a while, it's sort of like my brain catches on. My brain says, oh, I see what we're doing here. We're getting all this exogenous dopamine, which means dopamine coming from an external source, so my brain doesn't have to produce as much. So that now, when I use a pill, instead of feeling really, really good, it just brings me to normal, because our brain always wants us to be at normal and balance, right? So this is essentially what happens. This is what we call dopamine downregulation. It's downregulating the amount of dopamine you have. And this is what causes the tolerance effect. So I know there's some folks in this, I've been calling them old timers, and I think maybe that's insulting. So I'll say there are some folks in the room who may be older than me who might remember drinking Mad Dog 4040 and drinking Boone's Farm and whatever that was back in the day. I don't know what you did, all right? But you were living your lives. And when you took that first sip of Boone's Farm, it didn't take much to achieve that desired effect, right? But over time, through drinking more and more, you develop a bit of a tolerance. And it requires more of that drug, of that substance, to achieve the desired effect. Well, that's related to this process, right? So I was at a conference at Virginia Tech almost 2 years ago now. I was trying to figure out how I was going to communicate this more clearly. So I created this really crude graph to try to explain it. So imagine on a scale of 0 to 10, in terms of dopamine, and these are arbitrary numbers. Those numbers mean nothing. I'm just trying to make a point here. Alex wakes up at a 5. That's what my baseline normal dopamine is, right? And I use a drug, and I feel absolutely incredible, right? That opioid takes me to a 10. Nothing in my life has ever felt as good as that drug, right? Absolutely unreplicated. But eventually the effects of the drug wear off, and I have to return to baseline, come back to a 5, right? Well, I'm inclined to repeat the behavior. I got so much dopamine, I'm convinced it must be important for my survival. I use again, I feel really, really good. The effects of the drug wear off, I return to baseline. So after a period of time of doing that over and over and over again, my brain catches on, right? Like we said, my brain is trying to keep me in balance. So it goes, I get what we're doing here. We're getting a lot of this dopamine from outside, so I don't have to produce as much, right? So now, when I use a drug, I still feel really, really good, but I don't feel quite as good as I used to feel when I use the drug, right? So when you talk to people who get addicted, my friends in the room who may be in recovery, you'll understand this concept all too well. It's kind of a bummer that you'll understand this concept, but it's that idea of like chasing the first high, right? You can't ever get it back. Right? It's forever ruined for you as a person in recovery. You'll never get it back. That's a neurochemical reality. And just as importantly, now, when the effects of that drug wear off, you don't just come back down to baseline, you come back down slightly below baseline, right? So we're talking about early stage addiction here. This is someone who probably hasn't ruined relationships, probably still has a job, probably isn't involved with the law yet, but when they don't have a drug in their system, now they're a little bit anxious, maybe a little bit irritable, a little bit depressed, a little bit upset. Now they got two motivations to use a drug again. Not only to feel good, not only because they think it matters to their survival, but also so they don't feel bad, right? Positive and negative reinforcement. So they use again, and each time they use and come down and use and come down, you're getting a little less of the desired effect because your dopamine baseline is coming down and down. So you reach a point where you have to use a drug to feel the way you used to feel when you woke up in the morning, right? So I don't like the term functioning addict or functioning alcoholic, because I think they're stigmatizing terms, but that's essentially what this is referring to, right? When I was in Cincinnati, I was addicted to heroin. I was shooting heroin 6 times a day. I was wearing a suit and tie and going to work every day and collecting medical records for a personal injury firm downtown Cincinnati. And so I would keep up appearances and go to work, and I'd go shoot dope in the bathroom, right? And as long as I had heroin, I could function, right? Because heroin took me there. Heroin took me to baseline. But when you're in end-stage addiction and the effects of that substance wear off, you're absolutely miserable. And I think one of the things that's been harmful about the media and about pop science regarding addiction is we've overemphasized withdrawals. Everybody always talks about withdrawals, and people seem to think that withdrawals are the reason that people can't get into recovery. And I'm here to tell you, probably my friends in recovery would tell you this as well, when you go through an addiction, you become a veteran at getting through withdrawals, right? I was an expert at that stuff, you all. I didn't have any knowledge, but I had experience. So every time I ran out of money, I'd make sure I had a little bit of Gatorade, a little bit of Imodium, a little bit of Tylenol, and I'm gonna suffer. For 3 to 5 days, I'm gonna suffer. But I know that that's finite. And I know that in 5 days, I'm gonna get through withdrawals, and that physical aspect is mostly gonna be gone. What I couldn't bear is what comes next, is those prolonged, protracted effects of drug use on the brain. And that's really what I want us to focus on. So what's really cool is we can see this in a brain. So this is called a positron emission tomography. It's a PET scan. It's just a fancy way of looking at dopamine activity in the brain, right? And so what you notice, this brain on the left is called a control. It's just a normal person's brain. So it's some of your all's brains. Some of you all are clearly not normal, so it's not your brains, but there are a couple of you who may have a brain that looks like that. And what you notice is that there's plenty of dopamine bioavailable in that brain. So what does that mean? Why does this matter, right? Because we don't just want this to be academic. We want to understand why this matters, how this helps us. If you have that brain on the left, and you sit down with a friend to have a cup of coffee, that caffeine triggers the release of some of that dopamine, and it makes it a rewarding experience. Interacting with that friend and bonding triggers the release of some of that dopamine. It makes it a rewarding experience. So you can feel close to somebody, you can feel bonded to somebody, you can feel energized, euphoric as a result of the caffeine, right? That's a brain that works in a healthy way. If that person sits down and has some of that candy that's at the back of the room, right? Has some M&Ms, has some Halloween candy, there's plenty of dopamine in that brain to reward that behavior. Candy, good. I like candy, right? The brain on the right is a person who's addicted to cocaine. And so there's obviously a difference, right? Quite obviously, that person doesn't have as much bioavailable dopamine as the control. So why does that matter? Well, first of all, let's make the point. The reason that person's dopamine is so depleted is because of this process we've talked about, right? They use cocaine over and over again, so their dopamine baseline's gone down, down, down. Dopamine down regulation. So now that person sits down with a friend to have a cup of coffee. Caffeine, there's no dopamine to be released, right? So the caffeine doesn't do much. The bonding is empty. And any of my friends in the room in recovery can testify to this too. When you interact with people, when you're addicted, but drugs aren't involved, right? When it's not in the pursuit of the drugs, when you're just having an interaction with someone, it's empty. You're unable, you feel so disconnected. Think about your stereotype of someone who's addicted. What do they look like? Or they're isolated, right? They're totally isolated. They're totally staying away from connections, social connections, and of course they are, because there's nothing rewarding about that activity. And it's the same thing with food. If you've got that brain, because you're addicted, sitting down for a meal isn't really all that rewarding, because there's not enough dopamine to reward the meal. So you think about your stereotype of someone who's addicted. What do they look like? They're malnourished, they're gaunt, right? They're 50 pounds underweight. I certainly was when I was addicted. Well, of course they are. They don't have enough dopamine to reward eating. Food is no longer a sufficient stimulus, right? So we see this, I gave the example of cocaine there. We see this in all drugs of abuse. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about coke, meth, opioids, you're talking about alcohol. To some extent, all of those act on the brain. And Nora Volkov, the director of National Institute of Drug Abuse, has done a lot of this research. And she would tell you that it seems like meth and opioids affect the reward system to a greater extent than other drugs. Although all drugs seem to act on it except for like psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms and acid, things like that. So here's a critically important point. There's a reason I went through all that, because I know it's tempting to be like, Alex, we're not in school anymore, we don't care about this. Here's why it matters, right? So look, brain on the left, control brain, right? Normal person's brain, plenty of dopamine available. Brain in the middle looks exactly like an addicted person's brain, right? But there's a catch. That's not. That's the brain of someone who's 30 days sober, 30 days abstinent, right? But what does it look like? It looks identical to an addicted person's brain. Because the reality is, it hasn't come anywhere close to a healing, right? In order for the process to reverse, what we would call dopamine upregulation, that process is going to take years. So this person's just completed a 30-day treatment center. We've had a graduation ceremony, which sort of suggests to them that they're done, right? We didn't call it a commencement, we called it a graduation. Good job. We handed them a list of 12-step meetings in their community. We said, don't think, don't drink, and go to meetings. Good luck. And they went back into the community with an addicted brain, and we expected them to make sober decisions. So, as you'll see in a minute when we look at data, the vast majority are going to relapse. If you've got that brain, you're in abject misery, you all, because that's a brain it's called anhedonia. It's the inability to experience pleasure, because you need dopamine to experience pleasure. So whatever you did today that brought you pleasure, even something small, maybe it was like a song on the radio that brought you a little bit of joy. Maybe it was stepping outside to have a cigarette. Maybe whatever it was, you need dopamine. You need bioavailable dopamine for that to work. If you have an addicted brain, you're miserable. That drug is the only thing that brings a sufficient stimulus. So then when that person goes into the community, addicted brain, they relapse. The worst part of it all, to my mind, is we shame them. We tell them it was their fault, that they chose it, right? It's a disaster. So you look at the brain on the far right. That's the brain of someone who's addicted to meth, and now they're 2 years abstinent. It's 2 years of continuous abstinence. And what you see is that brain much more nearly approximates the control brain, right? That brain is really starting to heal. But do you notice that brain still isn't fully healed? After 2 years, you all. My friends in recovery in the room, you know how many days are in 2 years because you've counted them, right? Because you counted the hours in those days. That's a long time, and yet you're still not fully healed. So when do we heal? That's an important question. When do we heal? There's an argument to be made that you're never fully recovered. And I think there's good evidence to support that argument, but that's for a different day. What you're looking at here is a graph of, based on how long I've been sober, how likely is it that I'll remain sober, okay? So if you look at this first block of data over here, blue represents males, orange represents females. For people who have been sober for less than a year, only about 35% are going to remain sober, all right? That means 65% are going to relapse. That means 65% of people 6 months sober are going to relapse. Those are not seemingly not promising numbers, right? When you look at people who've been in recovery or been abstinent, this is specifically abstinence, this study. You look at people who've been abstinent 1 to 3 years, those numbers flip. And now 65% of those people are going to remain sober. So you could say that's promising, but I still look at that and go, 2 years in recovery, the amount of work that I put in to get to 2 years, to have a brain that looks like that, that's still jacked up, right? And to still have a 35% chance of disappointing my family, that's rough. And then something interesting happens. Somewhere between 3 and 5 years, there's what we call a plateau effect, where your risk of relapse drops below 15%. And the reason why this is an important number, it's not just a number we pull out of the sky. It's because 15% is approximately the risk of someone in the general population in Paris, Kentucky getting addicted, right? So when your risk of relapse falls to that of the risk of anyone in the general population becoming addicted to baseline, we call that full remission. So whether or not you're recovered, whether or not you're healed, is a different scientific discussion. It's a different spiritual discussion. It's a different discussion. From a clinical perspective, we call that full remission, right? I'll give you an example of why, just to put my 2 cents in, why, for me, personally, I don't believe that I'll ever be fully recovered. I was at a conference in Cincinnati earlier this year at the Harm Reduction Summit in Covington. And I heard a kid speak. His name's Austin Eubanks. Has anybody ever heard of Austin Eubanks? Yeah, so Austin Eubanks was wounded at Columbine. He was a student at Columbine. He was wounded, and he became addicted to opioids afterwards. He got into recovery, and he became this nationally renowned speaker. He traveled the country. He talked about trauma. He talked about emotional pain. He talked about his addiction. He was one of the most dynamic speakers I'd ever heard in my life. I remember just sitting in the room and being absolutely jealous of this guy. Like, man, this guy's got it going on. He's got it figured out. He was 10 years in recovery. That was in April. In May, I was on vacation with my family, and I was scrolling through the news, and I saw a headline on CNN that Austin Eubanks had relapsed and overdosed and died. 10 years in recovery. And I hope, wherever he is, that he doesn't mind me using him as an example, because that's a person who I respect so much. But that's a person who statistically was recovered, right? But are you ever fully recovered? I don't know. So an interesting way of thinking about why all this matters, and I'm getting to the bottom line in a second, I promise. This is a pretty recent study from Lamb and colleagues where they put monkeys in a cage, and they gave monkeys these 2 different levers. So the monkey would hit the first lever, and it would get a little food pellet. The monkey would hit the second lever, and it would get a hit of rimifentanil, which is a derivative of the fentanyl that we read about so much in the news, right? So at first, when the monkey would hit the lever for food, it would get the food pellet immediately. So that's a 0-second time delay. So on this graph, the x-axis is the time delay from hitting the lever to getting the food, and the y-axis is the number of times that the monkey chose to use the drug. So what you notice is, when the food pellet came immediately, the monkeys rarely wanted to use the drug. They weren't interested in it. They just wanted the food, they just wanted to be satisfied, they were fine. But then the researchers implemented this time delay, where now the monkey hits the lever to get food, and instead of getting food immediately, it takes 30 seconds, or 90 seconds, or 2 minutes. And so I've never seen a video of this. I can only imagine, when I read the study, I want to tell you what I imagined in my head. This is a dramatic recreation in my mind of this monkey in a cage, all right? So monkey's in the cage, hits the lever for food, food pellet drops immediately, monkey goes, monkey eats the food, right? You can see that my monkey's very happy, very satisfied with his, right? And he wiggles a little bit. Every time I've done this, Judge, my monkey wiggles, right? I don't know why. I can't stop. That's just how I imagine it. He's got a wagging tail, whatever. Monkey hits the lever for food, food drops down immediately, monkey's happy. Then the researchers implement the time delay. Monkey hits the lever for food, anticipatory dopamine already coming out, monkey's ready, nothing. So monkey's like, doesn't understand. Monkey looks around at other monkeys in the cage. What's going on here, my guys? I'm ready for this food. Monkey hits the lever, monkey hits the lever, hits the lever, hits the lever, nothing's coming down. Eventually, the monkey goes, well, forget it. And the monkey comes over here and hits this lever and takes the hit of rimifentanil, right? So I think this is kind of an analogy for early recovery. Because if you're one of my friends who's early in recovery and you've got this brain because of your drug use, you don't have dopamine in your brain. You can't experience pleasure because you don't have the pleasure chemical in your brain. So you're just like the monkey hitting the lever for food. You're doing all the right things. When you left that treatment center, they told you, go to meetings. They told you get a sponsor. They told you need to pray and meditate. They told you need to go to your doctor's visits. They told you need to exercise. They told you need to eat right. They gave you this list of things you can do to support your recovery. And you did every dang one of them, right? Every single one. Everything that was supposed to give you a reward, like the monkey hitting the lever. Every one, you did it right. But there's no reward. There's a time delay on the reward because you've got to let your brain heal. And if that time delay is too great, Eventually, we become exhausted, and eventually, we choose to use the drug, right? To me, that's such a great analogy for people early in recovery, because one of the things that we talk about so little that I find so important about early recovery is how miserable it is. And I don't know that everybody experiences this. I know some people who got into recovery and everything got better in their life from day one. And that's fantastic for them, and I wish it could be that way for all of us. I'm here to tell you that I struggled for a long time because I wasn't happy. And I had to face the fact, like, I didn't get sober to be unhappy, right? I got sober because I was unhappy, right? So I just kept fighting and fighting. So what do we need in order for people to get to that 3 to 5 year mark where their brains heal, where they can experience pleasure, where they can be full human beings again, where their lives have color again, where their lives have depth and weight and meaning, right? Well, you need long-term care. This seems obvious, right? So how do we handle it? See if you recognize this. Somebody in the community gets addicted. We send them to treatment, probably to a 30-day treatment center, maybe to a 90-day treatment center. And they get out of the treatment center, and like I said, we have a graduation. We hand them that list of 12-step meetings, because that's the only resource that we ever know, right? The impetus is on them to get connected with aftercare. They return to the community with an addicted brain. The vast majority relapse, as I showed you a second ago. So we send them back to treatment. Now they go for longer. Now they go for 120 days. And when they get finished, we have the same graduation. We hand them the same list of 12-step meetings that by now is probably outdated. You're probably going to churches that don't exist anymore. The first time I tried to go to a 12-step meeting was in Danville, Kentucky, at the Presbyterian Church, and there was a choir meeting when I got there. It wasn't an AA meeting, right? I walked in like I'm ready to talk about my addiction. They're like, we're here to talk about God. I'm like, well, whoops, might be in the wrong place. Maybe not, you pastor. Maybe not, but maybe. See? Very good. So, studies show that the average number of these cycles of relapse and remission for people with an opioid use disorder, heroin, Oxycontin, whatever, is 7 times. 7 times that I'm going to make a serious quit attempt and I'm going to relapse. What's the likelihood that a person's going to survive 7 cycles when 70,000 people in America are dying in a year from overdose, right? Maybe not all that likely. Why do so few maintain recovery? What's the problem? Well, the problem is, and I keep using my hands because I don't have a better way, because we know that addiction is a chronic disease. When I show you that brain scan that shows you even 2 years later, your brain hasn't fully healed. That's a chronic disease, right? Long, long term. But the treatment that we're applying to it is about like this, right? We're giving people acute treatment for a chronic disorder so their diseases are unmanaged for this period of time. And for some reason, we're incredulous when people relapse. We're incredulous when people become symptomatic, right? If you take blood pressure medication and you stop taking it and your blood pressure goes back up, would you be surprised? Well, of course not. You quit your treatment, right? So that's a serious problem. And I'll give you an interesting way of thinking about this. About 2 years ago, my dad had a heart attack. We played basketball a couple days a week at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Lexington. And my dad is 55. I'm not, again, no, I don't want to be ageist, no offense to my elders in the room, but my dad probably should not be on a basketball court, all right? It's just probably not the place for him and his joints. My dad had a heart attack while we were on a basketball court. It scared me to death. And we rushed him to the hospital. They put an emergency stent in. It saved his life, right? So an emergency stent is an acute response to my dad's chronic heart condition. But then pay attention to what the hospital did while he was there. During the 72 hours he was hospitalized, I was sitting in the room visiting with him when a nurse came to enroll him in 8 weeks of cardiac rehab, right? Strengthen his heart. And then during the first week that he left the hospital, someone called to ensure he'd fill his prescriptions. And a week after that, someone called to ensure he wasn't having any adverse effect from his medication, right? So what's the hospital doing? Or if you're a cynic like me, what's the insurance company doing, right? They're trying to maximize the return on their investment, right? Because I don't know what it costs to fix somebody's heart by going in through their arm, but I imagine that's an expensive procedure. So sake of argument, let's say they spent $50,000 for that acute procedure to put the stent in and save my dad's life. They know, because they have all the appraisals and all the data, they know that if that's all they do, that acute treatment, and they send my dad back out into the community, there's a strong likelihood he's going to return in 5 years or 10 years with another heart-related condition, right? He's going to return with another heart-related condition, and it's going to cost them another $50,000 to treat his acute disease. So instead, what do? They take his chronic heart disease, and they manage it on a chronic basis, right? So now he meets with a nutritionist. Now he has to watch his diet. Now he has to watch the way in which he exercises. Now he takes medication every day because we use medication for chronic diseases, my friends, right? He does all of these things and he manages his heart disease. This is how we manage all chronic diseases: asthma, hypertension, diabetes, right? If you have diabetes, we don't just wait for you to have a diabetic episode, right? Every day you check your blood sugar and you take your insulin. You manage your disease. Addiction's no different. The problem is we treat it differently. So, like, 5 more minutes, and I swear I'm done. 5 minutes. Let's take a quick look back at the way that we've looked at addiction and the way that it's changed, because it matters. So this is your evolutionary chart, right? You see what I did there? That's cheeky and that's fun. Okay, so about 50 years ago, starting with Nixon and Reagan really picked up the mantle. We had a war on drugs, right? And by virtue of fighting a war on drugs, you wage a war on people who use drugs. Didn't work. The focus of that whole approach was a jail cell. Simply didn't work. Made matters worse. Whole lot of unintended consequences. So we woke up in like the early 2000s, in part because a lot of this brain research, we woke up a little bit. And we said, we got to start treating people's disease. We know this is a disease. We got to start treating it like a disease. So we started sending people to treatment. You saw the advent of things like drug courts and recovery courts and family courts, all these sorts of things, right? We're going to start using treatment to address addiction, not just the court system. But the problem was, our approach was acute treatment, right? So we still had the issue of really high relapse rates. We still find ourselves smack dab in the middle of an opioid epidemic, right? So the latest evolution, the direction that everything's going, is towards these things called recovery-oriented systems of care. And we could spend another 3 hours talking about ROSCs, and I won't do that to you, but I just want to make a couple points about this. I don't know how well you all can see this, but from where you're sitting, can you tell what is the center of a recovery-oriented system of care? What is that? Can you tell what that is? It's a person, right? It's the person. This is person-centered care. The focus of the latest evolution was a treatment center. The focus before that was a jail cell. The focus here is a person in their community context. The focus here is a person who's lifelong born and bred in Bourbon County, getting well in Bourbon County, right? Maybe they go to treatment. Maybe they do. What you notice is I'm not saying treatment doesn't matter. You see treatment there. Treatment is one of the tools in our tool belt, but it's not the focal point. The focal point, if you ask somebody in the general public, well, so-and-so is addicted, what are we going to do for him? We got to get him into treatment. That's all any of us know. We got to send him to treatment. For many people, especially those with severe substance use disorders, you need treatment. I needed treatment. But that was one piece of the puzzle, right? That wasn't the whole thing. What I also needed was those long-term recovery supports when I got out, because I have a chronic disease, right? And I've been telling people treatment's fine. Just a weird analogy that I learned from a guy named John Kelly, who runs the Recovery Research Institute. If you have high blood pressure and you take blood pressure medication, your blood pressure goes down, right? Then let's say after a year or so, you get to feeling better, and you think, I don't think I need to take that medication anymore. So you stop taking it, your blood pressure shoots up. Would we say that that blood pressure medication works or it doesn't work? It works, right? It works. You got to take it, right? But it works. It's fine. So compare that to this. Someone gets addicted. They're showing all these symptoms of a substance use disorder. We send them to a 30-day treatment center. During the 30 days that they're there, we see their symptoms go down, right? They're no longer using drugs. They're no longer experiencing the consequences. They're starting to heal a little bit. And then after 30 days, they leave treatment and they relapse. We see all those symptoms return, right? Do we say that treatment worked or treatment didn't work? We say it didn't work, right? We say things like treatment didn't take. Or people ask me all the time, why did Salvation Army work? Those other treatments didn't work, right? Treatment's fine. Treatment was fine. Do you know that people tend to be sober when they're in treatment? Right? Not 100%. I can attest to that. People tend to be in recovery when they're in treatment, right? Treatment's fine. The problem is you can't keep people in treatment for the 3 to 5 years that they need, because that's not realistic. We have scarce resources. That's not going to work. So what are we going to do instead? Instead, we're going to bring all the resources that make treatment really effective, and we're going to transplant it, lift it up, and drop it into a community context. Take all of those things that helped you stay sober for those first difficult 30 days, and we're going to take them to the community context. So I'll give you a way of thinking. We call these things recovery capital. I'll say this really quickly. It's all of the things that you already know matter, right? You know stable housing matters. What kind of housing, what kind of sober living is available in this community? critical question, right? You know that having health insurance matters. It's going to determine the kind of quality care that you can get access to. We know that having a job matters, right? Having meaningful employment matters, right? We know that having access to mental health services matters. One of the most important things I did in recovery was when I started working with a therapist, started addressing anxiety. We know that all these relationships matter. We know that improving your relationships with your family and having family support, like the group that you are bringing to this church, we know that matters, right? We know leaving behind that old social network of people you used with and integrating into a new sober social network, we know that matters, right? We know that living in a community, Bourbon County, that doesn't stigmatize addiction, where employers provide job opportunities, where we see transformational employment, all these sorts, we know these things matter, right? These are also all the same things, if you think about it, that were present in the treatment context. Because when I was in treatment, I had a stable place to live, right? I had a place to lay my head every night. I didn't have to wonder. I had access to nutritious meals, right? I had constant access to positive social support all the time, constantly reinforced. I was forced to go to 4 meetings a day, right? I was bleeding from my ears. I had so much peer support, right? All these things that we know matter, I was surrounded by it. So if recovery capital is what we need, treatment is like Fort Knox for recovery capital. It's all of it, right? Problem is, we're taking people out of that thriving environment and we're taking them into environments where they don't have what they need. So last analogy I want to give you before I finish up. My first job in recovery was working in a tobacco field. Have any of you all ever worked in tobacco before? You know, nobody smiles when they say that. When they're like, you know? Yeah, I get it. It's the first time I ever did labor in my entire life. Like, I'd had jobs before that, but I worked at like local taco in Lexington. It's like a, you know, like a bar back. Like, that's not labor. Tobacco is labor. But I was working for UK. We were doing research on different varieties of tobacco, trying to find varieties that have less carcinogens, right? So what we would do, we develop them in a lab. We plant the seeds in these float trays. They'd be in a greenhouse, right? And what was so interesting about a greenhouse is, because I have no botany background, no ag background, what was so fascinating is that they're these perfect environments where they're climate controlled, right? Where they have constant access to, like air control. It controls the amount of sunlight that the plants get. It has constant access to moisture, to water, all the nutrients it needs. So what do you know? The plants thrive in that environment, right? They absolutely shoot up. And then when they reach a certain degree of maturation, we would load those float trays onto a truck. We'd drive them out to a field. We'd set the tobacco, right? And if the soil's good, if the conditions are good, if we have adequate rainfall that year, access to adequate sunlight, plenty of nutrients, the plants grow and thrive. But if we took them to soil that's bad soil, that has blue mold, or has too much rain, or not enough rain, doesn't have the right conditions, they wilt and they die, right? Anybody catch my analogy here, right? So a greenhouse is like a treatment center, right? It's climate-controlled recovery. Everything that makes recovery effective is right there in treatment. Treatment's great. Treatment works. I'm a fan of treatment. The problem is, if you take people out of that environment, you rip them up out of the soil, they haven't reached maturation as a plant yet, right? So we saw that brain's not nearly healed. And we take them out into the community, and we plant them in bad soil, and they die, and we go, well, you're a bad plant, right? How could you die on me, right? Well, didn't have access to what they needed. So, I told you, I stayed at the Salvation Army 6 months. And when I left the Salvation Army, I had all those barriers that are characteristic of people leaving treatment. I had bad credit, I had lots of debt, I had a criminal record, I had no marketable skills, I had no employment history, I had no college degree, I was totally unemployable. I qualified for Section 8 housing, but I was disqualified by virtue of the fact that I had a drug trafficking charge. I had no idea where I was going to live, no idea what I was going to do. And there was a church in Lexington that let me sleep at the parsonage for free, because the pastor knew my parents. So they let me sleep at the parsonage in exchange for doing labor until I got back on my feet. And then that job in a tobacco field I got because one of my dad's patients gave me a chance. I didn't deserve it, right? I didn't earn it. It wasn't based on merit. They just gave me a chance. And then because I got that job, I had health insurance. And then because I had health insurance, I was able to go meet with a therapist. And then because I was able to meet with a therapist, I was able to address my anxiety. And as soon as I started addressing my anxiety, I felt myself being more pro-social. And then I really did want to go to meetings and interact with people. And every resource that I had access to built upon the last. And I was building up my recovery bank account, right? I was building up recovery capital, building up the resources. And so often now, when I do a speaking engagement, my friends in recovery probably have experienced this too. People come up to you afterwards and they say just the kindest things. And they're like, Alex, we're proud of you because you're so strong and you're so brave and you're so resilient. And I promise you all, I wish those things were true. I promise you, I have an ego that desperately wants those things to be true, but I promise you they're not true. I promise you I'm not in recovery because I want it. That's not how this thing works. I know that's the narrative we hear every day. You gotta want it, you gotta want it. I'm telling you all, it's not how this thing works. I'm in recovery today because I got access to the things that I needed on an ongoing basis. I'm in recovery today because my chronic disease was finally managed on a chronic, ongoing basis. And what do you know? When you match disease management to disease, people get well. And the reason why I stress that I didn't do this, it wasn't about wanting it, it wasn't about how hard that I worked, is because that's such a harmful narrative for our friends and our loved ones who are still addicted. Because there's another side of that coin. If you say I'm in recovery because I'm strong, then my friends are addicted because they're weak, and that's BS, you all. That's not true. It's simply untrue, and there's no data to support anything like that. I think it's such a harmful narrative. I'm not discounting the work that people do in recovery. I worked really hard to get to where I am, but in the work that we do with Beyond, when I look at some of the folks in drug court, and I compare the access to help that I had compared to what they have, well, of course I recovered. I had everything anyone could ask for. If you could draw up an ideal situation, you draw up my situation. Of course I recovered. Not because I wanted it any more than them, right? But then if you compare those folks, many of them, to some of my friends who are still in jail, of course they should recover, because my friends in jail don't have nearly the same amount of resources, right? So the bottom line is, like, there are so many harmful narratives that we perpetuate incidentally, totally by accident, about you gotta want it. That's the one I hear the most that just rubs me the wrong way. You gotta want it. I promise you all I didn't want it. I promise you, when I was sleeping under a bridge, September 12th, 2013, what I wanted was a shot of heroin to make it all go away. And instead, I had nowhere to go, and I had no money, and I had to go to treatment, right? I didn't want it, but then I got what I needed, right? That's what makes the difference. So last thing I want to share with you, and I'm absolutely done. I got to make a shameless plug for Voices of Hope. So we're a recovery community organization, which means what we do is recovery capital. What we do is help people build all of those resources that we're talking about. So we're not a treatment center, right? We leave that to other people who do it much better than we ever could. What we do is we come alongside folks when they leave treatment, or folks who never go to treatment, because believe it or not, the majority of people in recovery today never spend a day in treatment. Believe that or not. And we do all kinds of things. We offer scholarships, we help people get their records expunged, we have dozens of meetings every week, we have all the A's, we have AA, NA, CA, CMA, we have Drug Addicts Anonymous, we have a secular AA meeting, and then we have Recovery Dharma, which is based on Buddhist principles, and we have Smart Recovery, which is based on CBT, and the list goes on and on and on. We want to provide a space for absolutely everybody in recovery. We have yoga, we have sober social events. I know Johnny brings a lot of his guys out there, we have a good time. We just want to support people in recovery, right? That's what we do. And so I guess the last thing that I want to say to you all, because you're the audience that matters, because you're the people who are willing to come out at 6 o'clock on a Thursday night, the people who care about your community enough to do that. We've got to find some innovative ways to support people in recovery when they come back into the community. We've got to find ways to do that. We've got to stop telling people you're good to go after 30 days, right? Because we know that's not true. So I don't know what you heard today. I don't know what helps, but I hope it helps you wrap your mind around this thing a little bit. We match a chronic disease with chronic management, and people get well.